I'm more than happy that today I can, sorry, because of the tuning in, we can start up to that. I can present you our dear colleague, and almost I can say friend in a way, although we do not know each other for a very long time. Dr. and Professor Francesco Stolfi. Jovica and me, as you know, recently had the chance to spend 3 weeks in Macquarie University in Sydney on a study trip, and we really enjoyed in many ways, as you might have heard on our presentation, what was 2 weeks ago and something like that. And the part of the whole story was that we really met fantastic people as a people and as an experts really in that. We invited, of course, all of them to come. And I think that we have very substantial interests, or at least 4 or 5 people who are doing very serious, very interesting stuff that might be interesting for us as well. And since Francesco hasn't been in Belgrade and Yugoslavia or Serbia before that, we use this nice occasion that at this moment is, of course, summer in Australia, and they are having summer holidays. So he's spending 2.5 months in Europe, and he immediately responded to our invitation to come here, and voila, here he is with us. You have got some basic overview in his CV. Especially, I would pay attention to very specific papers he published in the last 10 years, which are dealing with very interesting stuff about the crisis management, and so on, especially about Mediterranean countries, if I may say. He recently visited Portugal before coming here, which was also very interesting experience and so on. And when we were speaking, by the way, he's still until tomorrow with us. Tonight, you may see him on the main news on Nova S television. He will be there for 12-15 minutes speaking about the recent crisis in EU, about energy crisis and everything that's going on. And he will be giving an interview tomorrow for NIN magazine about more or less same issues. So when we spoke about possibilities and ideas about current lecture, we came to one of the things that he recently worked on, and which is very interesting for us, especially concerning methodology. So as you will see, he is doing something which unfortunately not a lot of people are doing in our region. And this is really following impacts of concrete directives and how specific lobby groups, interest group are, how should I say, forming implementation of specific things and directives and legal issues, and how it end up, what is the final results of specific issues, especially, as you know, in Serbia, it's a big problem because most of the laws in our country, it's not only in our country, are being passed because somebody else told the government that they should be passing that, and not a lot of people are taking care about what's going to be the real consequences of concrete issues. So anyway, I will not take more time of our today's presentation. And I will ask Francesco to add if he needs something more about him, his interest, and so on. And of course, to start with the presentation, benvenuto e speriamo che questa non è l'ultima opportunità di vederla a Belgrado.
Grazie mille. And again, thank you for having me, and Misha and Jovica. It was really lovely to meet them in Australia, and it's really lovely for me to be here and have this exchange of ideas with my colleagues here with you. And yeah, I won't spend more time before we get into the meat of the presentation, so I guess we can get started. So Apologies for the boring title, the implementation of the EU Services Directive, Directive 2006-123/EC, in Greece 2010-2018. Very dry title. I have to apologize. I hope, however, that I will convince you by the end of the presentation that it's actually an exciting topic. Oh, down. Easy. Look. Perfect. So, and it's exciting because it's about conflict and it's about winners and losers. I'm interested in issues where, so to speak, as a political scientist, where there is blood, meaning blood over distributive outcomes, where there is conflict. So who wins and who loses. And specifically in this case is conflict over the liberalization of professional services. So the key motivation really for me to do this work was to add a political economy dimension and a dimension emphasizing conflict over distributive outcomes in the context of a broader literature on compliance with European legislation that, to my mind, is somewhat bloodless in the sense that it doesn't really, not all of it, but a lot of it doesn't really emphasize this type of domestic conflict over distribution, which is really what I'm interested in. So, in this piece of research, I wanted to go beyond simply compliance with or formal compliance with European legislation and go to the issue of how this legislation then hits the ground and how and whether it makes a difference for people's lives beyond simple formal rules. This means going beyond a lot of the most established ways of looking at this type of issues in the context of the literature on Europeanization. There is a lot of work that explains compliance with and transposition of European legislation based, for instance, on national styles. Some countries are said to be very rule of law oriented. Others, and especially Eastern European countries, are supposed to be so-called dead letter countries, meaning that they focus simply on implementing formalities or rather introducing formalities into their legal frameworks, but not actually implementing them. Others focus on the so-called fit-misfit between domestic institutions or domestic policies and what comes from the European level. And the argument being that the greater the misfit, the more difficult the compliance with European legislation is going to be. Others talk about administrative efficiency. More efficient countries with more efficient bureaucracies are going to be better able to comply with European legislation. Others finally talk about veto players. The more the institutional framework of a country creates points where potential opponents can stop legislation, the more difficult compliance is going to be. So, for instance, in federal countries where there are different levels of government, then compliance is going to be more difficult. And all this is obviously matters, but I am especially interested in my research in looking at power differences, how different domestic actors possessing of different degrees of power are able, and through which ways, through which strategies, they're going to be able to shape the way the legislation that comes from Europe is actually implemented domestically. So that's what I'm really interested in. Conflict, distributive conflict over how European legislation is implemented. And in this work and in other work that I've been doing, I'm especially interested in occupations and professions. And I find professions fascinating because when we talk about professions, we are talking not only about issues of income distribution, but we are talking about issues that commingle, if you will, intellectual concerns and material concerns. And we are talking about people's identities. I'm pretty sure, if I can speak for myself, but I probably share this with you, I see myself, I have to admit, not only as Francesco, but as a political scientist. You know, it's really drilled in me. It's part of my identity. And this also applies more generally to other professional categories. So as professionals, we identify with what we do individually, but often I would say also politically. Our political views are shaped by our professional identity. So the point that I'm getting at is that when we are looking at the implementation of European legislation in a member state, or maybe even in states of the neighborhood, we are looking at how then the reception of and implementation of European legislation is seen through the lights of professions, and hence how people on the ground look at Europe. Is Europe good for us or is it bad for us, right? So implementation and professions really get mixed up in, among other things, in the view of Europe, in the way, and also in the view of how democracy works. So why specifically the case of the implementation of the EU's Services Directive on the liberalization of professional services in Greece? So let me just give you the rationale behind this choice. The Services Directive is the infamous Bolkestein Directive, and about liberalization. Liberalization means the reduction in the barriers to entry into a profession, as well as the loosening of the rules about how professionals operate within the profession. So that's what we mean by liberalization. And specifically, the infamous Bolkestein Directive introduced in its Article 16 the provision of the freedom to provide services, which effectively requires the opening of domestic markets for professional services. And this is part of what in scholarly jargon more broadly is called negative integration. So the European Union has been really built on constructing a common market. And the most efficient way of doing this is through so-called negative integration, meaning eliminating as much as possible rules that prevent the circulation of people, of goods, and services. And so as part of that, this Services Directive was introduced in 2006, and for the facilitation of the competition in also professional services. And as a Greek legal scholar, Atsopoulos, wrote, this was the most widely and most passionately discussed text of secondary legislation in the history of the European Union. Again, it goes really, when we think about the liberalization of professional services, we really go to the core of people's livelihoods and people's identity. The moment you talk about opening up who can work in your field and what rules define how you work, you're really talking about affecting people's livelihoods for better or for worse, and affecting, I would argue, also their identities, their professional and political identities. You might remember, it is in this context, in fact, that in France, there was this big uproar over this directive at the time when it was being negotiated about the so-called, to the Polish plumber, le plombier polonais. The idea being, oh, we're going to get all these Polish plumbers stealing jobs from our artisans, from our workmen. And I remember always very fond of that. The Polish government was, very sarcastically and very smartly said, you guys, don't worry. We will stay in Poland, and you come to Poland as a tourist and visit. Come to Poland and visit us. And this piece of legislation that, again, was hotly debated, it was watered down, but this principle was enshrined. This freedom to provide services was enshrined as Article 16. Remains to this day a very hotly contested piece of legislation. From my own country, you can see here a demonstration against the Porcestein directive, that's so called. In Italy, for instance, we now have, to this day, one of the electoral promises of the current Meloni government was protecting small entrepreneurs from the Porcestein or Bolkestein when it comes, for instance, to the small businesses that manage beach concessions. They should be opened up for the provision of professional services in that area. And the Meloni government promised that this was never going to happen, or it's going to happen in 20 years from now. In 2022 alone, the Commission opened infringement procedures against 12 member states over specifically this piece of legislation. Again, I hope I convinced you that it's an important core piece of legislation for the European Union. And why specifically Greece? Well, because Greece, as we all know, was under huge financial pressure, starting in 2010, obviously, with the financial crisis, had to make recourse to external support by the so-called Troika, the ECB, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Commission. In exchange, it had to agree over 3 times to implement significant structural reforms between 2010 and 2018. And as part of these structural reforms, the Troika requested the implementation, finally, of the Services Directive, the implementation of the liberalisation of professions. So very strong external pressure over a country or against a country that came actually to it with very high level of protection for its professions. So what I found very interesting is, okay, we have a case of a directive that really aims to change the way people do their jobs. And in a situation where a country is really pressed to implement these structural reforms, but it actually comes to it with a very, very high level of what we called before misfit. So what happens, right? And the question specifically, and again, that's because I'm interested in power issues, so to speak, is how differences in power across and within 4 professions that differ in their level of internal cleavages, but also the different levels of power, as I will define in a moment, affected the scope and speed of implementation of the Services Directive over the course of the 8-9 years when Greece was under pressure to implement the structural reform plans. So now we go through a few definitional issues. I've been talking about power. I'm also interested in issues of how power differs or how preferences differ within professions, so the cleavages within professions. So let's talk briefly about how I define power. Power is mostly, in the literature on interest groups, is mostly seen as the ability to access policymakers. And there are different markers of power in this sense. First, there is a kind of a traditional capital difference between insiders and outsiders, insider and outsider groups. An insider group is an interest group that is regularly consulted, for instance, maybe because it has a lot of technical knowledge. So an insider group is a group that is consulted by Parliament, or by commissions in Parliament, or by the government, or by the bureaucracy. Outsiders are those who are not, and they're not because probably then may even not be considered professions, if you're talking about professions, but are more like occupations without strong technical knowledge to share with the policymakers. Connectedly, the power to access policymakers is connected to the financial and organizational resources of the interest groups, to the electoral clout, obviously, in a democracy. So all these things come under the heading of power as ability to get in touch regularly, on a regular basis, with policy makers. Interest groups that command financial resources, interest groups that command votes. It stands to reason they are better able to speak to politicians and bureaucrats. Power can, again, in the classical distinction between voice and exit, is also the ability to voice one's preferences and voice one's pleasure or displeasure with what policymakers do. So organizing an effective strike, for instance, is a form of voice. Some actors are better able to strike than others. In the case at hand, I chose tourist guides. Nobody cares if tourist guides strike. And taxi drivers. Taxi drivers actually matter a lot, right? So that's a difference in voice. But I'm not only interested in power of the profession as a whole, I'm interested in divisions between potential winners and losers from liberalization within a profession. In some professions, competition is looked askance, it's looked negatively at. Taxi drivers and tourist guides come to mind. In other professions, it really depends. Some big gorillas in the jungle maybe want more competition, right? Because they can better outcompete smaller players. So in that case, when there are differences in preferences within a profession, then what really matters is who controls the external representation of the profession. And that's what I'm getting at. So power and cleavages are the key definers of how I chose the professions to look at and to analyze over, obviously, the 150 occupations and professions that were liberalized, or the government tried to liberalize over the period of the adjustment programs. And so that's in terms of what we call independent variables, cleavages and power. In terms of the dependent variable implementation, I'm looking at the scope and speed of implementation. I'm going to tell you right now what I mean by it. By scope, I mean how close, or conversely, how far are the reforms that were implemented from what the professions or subgroups within the professions wanted them. So how close is the outcome from the preferences of the professions or subgroups within them? And this is operationalized, and the extent of actual implementation, not legal formulation of these liberalization measures. In the case of Greece, but this is obviously applies to any country, you can pass a piece of legislation and never implement it. Maybe because you forgot to implement the presidential decree that needs to be put in the books before the law becomes actually operative, right? Or you pass the piece of legislation, but then the presidential decree formulates some rules that really defeat the purpose of the formal piece of legislation. This is done everywhere, and this is what I'm looking at. In terms of scope, in terms of speed, it does matter how fast these measures are implemented. If you can kick the can down the road, maybe in the end, people will forget about this, right? And something else will happen. And that's a very common strategy. And it did work in some cases here, as we will see. So in this case, this is operationalized as the time elapsed from the original liberalization deadline, which was 2009, and when the rules were actually implemented. So I was already mentioning the criteria whereby I chose these professions, 2 outsiders and 2 insiders. The outsiders are tourist guides and taxi owners, united in their opposition to liberalization, and the insiders are lawyers and engineers. Lawyers and engineers are overrepresented as insiders, for instance, in parliament. Again, in Greece, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same in Serbia. Certainly, this is the case in many other countries in Europe. A lot of members of parliament are actually lawyers, right? And specifically, I chose a group where the dominant actors in the profession are pro-liberalization, lawyers, and one where the dominant actors are anti-liberalization, engineers. And I guess I'm not providing any spoilers if I say that, surprise, surprise, it is the dominant actors that won out in each case, right? Again, what I find interesting is not so much, or not only that I can show that power matters, which often in the studies of Europeanization is taken only as a marginal consideration, but that it mattered under conditions of extreme external pressure, right? And the pressure coming from the financial crisis. So let's talk briefly about these professions. Tourist guides are individual operators. They are brought together in a union that is, enjoys limited organizational resources. It's largely staffed by volunteers. And when I talked to the members of the unions and officials of the unions, until the last minute, they were even unaware of the measures that were going to hit them. When the Services Directive was formally introduced in Greece, it gave 4 months to the professions to give their comments. The poor tourist guys didn't even know that had been introduced. So they didn't even have time to provide comments on it in time. And as typical outsiders, nobody cared about them. They were only finally able to have conversations with the government officials when Syriza, the left-wing combination of parties, came to power in 2015. But by then it was too late. By then they were only able kind of to ameliorate some of the concerns, but not really to change facts on the ground. Taxi owners are, it's not working. Oh, there you go. So taxi owners, it's a bit different. So in terms of power, they are a bit more powerful than tourist guides. They are better organized because they're organized in cooperatives. They, as I mentioned before, they have more voice than the poor tourist guides because they can organize disruptive strikes. They have political links, traditionally to Nea Demokratia, which is a center-right party now in power, and later also to Syriza, to the center or to the left. Moving to the insider groups, I said before the lawyers and engineers are both overrepresented in parliament. That's already a marker of insidership. But also bar associations, speaking of lawyers, are integral really to the functioning of the legal system. And in terms of the representation of the profession, specifically the Athens Bar Association, being located in the capital, has disproportional influence over the representation of all Greek lawyers. Kind of informally, because formally they're all the same. And speaking now of the divisions within the cleavages within the profession, the divisions are really in terms of location and size. Big city lawyers were actually in favor of, or many of them were in favor of liberalization because for them it meant expanding to the provinces, right? Be better able to compete with small city lawyers. So Athens and Thessaloniki versus the rest, that's how I saw it. And likewise, larger versus smaller practices. The liberalization of the profession of lawyers meant, for instance, elimination of minimum fees. Well, that's good if you're a big practice that want to pay young lawyers very little. Or if you're a bank who wants to pay lawyers by the hour, right? Not if you're a small practice or a small lawyer that depend actually on those mandatory fees. For engineers, conversely, by the way, engineers also are integral to the operation of any state because they provide essential technical services, obviously in terms of the safety of building, for instance, or infrastructure. In the case of Greece, of the engineers in Greece, as in many other countries, there is a chamber of engineering called the Technical Chamber of Greece. In this case, the chamber represents all engineers in Greece. And the Technical Chamber is controlled, the institutions of both the General Assembly and the Executive are controlled by the established and also largest specializations such as civil engineering and mechanical engineering, and by the graduates of so-called five-year institutions. Those have got they graduated from programs that last 5 years. So whilst in the case of lawyers, representation is in the hands informally of the Athens Bar Association, in the case of engineers, the representation is formally, it's mandated through the Technical Chamber of Greece, within which it is the established specialization and the 5-year engineers that control representation. In this case, the conflict is, or I saw that it was between established and newer or insurgent specializations, such as chemical or environmental engineers, and also between graduate or 4-year technical institutions and 5-year institutions. So, what are the expectations that drove the paper? Well, that first, the more powerful the professional specialization, the closer the scope of the actual implementation of liberalization is going to be to its preferences. With the proviso that I said before, that not all professional actors may be against liberalization. Also, the more powerful the opponents of liberalization, the slower the liberalization is going to be. And thirdly, the more divided the profession, the slower implementation is going to be, because before you can implement, you have to have a resolution of the internal conflict within the profession. So dividing between unified and divided professions or occupations, as I said before, when it comes to unified professions where everybody was against increased competition, then my expectation is that the fewer access goods you have, meaning the fewer resources you have to access policymakers, then the higher the speed of implementation and the broader the scope of implementation. That's the case of tourist guides. If you have some access goods, or if you have some voice, then I would expect still high speed compared to the divided technical professions, but not as high as for the tourist guides, and smaller scope of actual implementation. That's the case of taxi owners. When it comes to divided professions, in both cases enjoying significant access goods, then it really depends on who's the dominant actor. If the dominant actor is pro-liberalization, then I'm going to expect a greater implementation than in the case, that would be the case of lawyers, compared to the case of engineers, where the dominant actors were against liberalization. And likewise, I expect the speed of implementation to be slower compared to the taxi drivers and tourist guides, but not as slow in the case of lawyers as engineers, again, because of the greater opposition coming from engineers. So, briefly, and Misha, please let me know about how I'm doing with time. Before we get to the meat of the case, how things really operated, just a brief reminder of the broad outlines of the liberalization process. The process began for most professions with Law 3919 of 2011, which was a framework law for the implementation of services liberalization. The law was actually first introduced as a bill already in 2010, as soon as the economic adjustment plan was approved, and as soon as the government, the Greek government at the time under Prime Minister Papandreou, PASOK government, a socialist government. The laws that you see after that are all implementations, if you will, of the framework law. We can already see that the laws affecting taxi owners and tourist guides were earlier in 2012 than the other laws. One was under Papademos, the Papademos government. Papademos was a former head of the Greek central bank, and it was a largely technical government. And under the first economic adjustment plan, the Samaras government stepped in 2012, this was a grand coalition of the PASOK Socialist and New Democracy center-right government under the New Democracy Prime Minister Samaras. In 2013, the Lawyers Code, which changes the competition rules about lawyers, was introduced. Behind schedule, the Samaras government has said that this would be implemented in 2012, but that didn't happen. And I will also point to you that two laws for engineering needed to be introduced. One in 2014, by the Samaras government, and then by the Tsipras Syriza government in 2016 with the last economic adjustment plans. Why two? Because of conflict, as we will see, and the continuing dynamics of the Troika pressing for liberalization and engineers and the government pushing back. So let's look then finally to what happened on the ground, beginning with the preferences and outcomes regarding tourist guides and taxi owners. The tourist guides had two big issues that they were concerned with, both connected to ease of competition in their field. First, until the service directive, tourist guides in Greece could only operate in one site for which they've been certified. It's a huge way to reduce competition, obviously, right? And what the Services Directive mandated, as per the law, that the 2011 framework law, was the elimination of these site-specific authorizations. Secondly, in order to practice as a tourist guide, you had to attend a special vocational school, 2.5 years, and this operated both as a gate, limiting access to the profession, but also as a source of occupation for tourist guides, right? Because they would teach there and so get some income from that. So this is what they wanted. They were against elimination of site-specific authorizations and against closing of vocational schools. So what happened? The site-specific authorizations were eliminated already in 2010, i.e. even before the framework law was passed. It was like this. They were hit and they didn't even know what hit them, right? They even didn't know that this was in the works. Secondly, in 2012, the law that I mentioned before that was approved in 2012 mandated the closing of vocational schools in order to allow all graduates from relevant disciplines like archaeology, history, and so on to practice their profession. So they were defeated along the entire line. In 2017, after the Syriza government got into power, and this is key, when the economic conditions of Greece turned towards the better, and so the government was no longer so eager or so in need of external support, the government, the Syriza government, they met with them and gave them a little bit of a helping hand by reopening the vocational schools, but the vocational schools are still not anymore a requirement to enter the profession, i.e. they're no longer a gate into the profession, but they've been restored as a source of income, potentially, for those who want to teach into them. For taxi owners, obviously, they were against liberalization of taxi licenses. The liberalization was introduced with the application of a mathematical formula in the 2012 law that I mentioned before. But then what is fascinating that the way the formula worked when it was finally implemented in 2014 was that especially in the key urban areas, Thessaloniki and Athens, it produced actually a lower number of licenses than before, right? So in practice, it actually had the opposite result that what it's supposed to produce. Let's move to the insiders. And as I said before, they were largely divided, lawyers, by location and size. The key issues, or some of the key issues that there was conflict over, was the elimination of geographical restrictions, which here for lawyers means that before the Lawyers Code of 2013, if you wanted to operate in another city different from your bar where you had been associated with, you had to associate yourself with a local lawyer, right? And this provided small town lawyers with some business, right? Because if a big city lawyer had to work in a smaller city, they had to associate to them a local lawyer, right? And again, it's a constraint on competition, and the European Union, the Troika, was very keen on eliminating that. And this was supported, not so unsurprisingly, by big city practices, right? Elimination of minimum fees, as I have heard before. If you eliminate minimum fees, larger practices can better compete with smaller practices, but also and it was actually interesting that banks were very much involved in this conversation, could hire young lawyers at minimal rates, right? Lower than was mandated before, right? And it is part of this, what some people have called the proletarization of the lawyer profession. Finally, introduction of multidisciplinary practices, which means, say, lawyers working with accountants or with financial experts. And in this case, all lawyers were against it because they were afraid that the economies of scale would work against it. The creation of big multidisciplinary practices in a small country like Greece would actually put a lot of lawyers, even big lawyers, out of business. So they were all against it. So what happened? The new Code of Lawyers was eventually passed late in 2013. The ban on multidisciplinary practice was actually retained against the pressure from the European Union. Minimum fees were eliminated, which is what all the big players wanted, and the territorial restrictions to the practice of civil and administrative law were eliminated. And it was fascinating that when the issue was debated, all the bar associations from the provinces, so to speak, pressured to have these restrictions maintained, and they asked the key bar association, the Athens, to speak on their behalf, and the Bar Association of Athens refused. They said, we don't care. Again, not surprising. Let's move to engineers. Here, the division was not by size or by location, but by discipline and education, right? As I mentioned before. And in this case, the issues were the opening of the scope of activities to newer specializations. The situation in Greece was that the ground had actually been marked already in the 1930s. So the specializations that were around in the 1930s, such as civil engineers, and mechanical engineer had already staked the ground and say, we can do A, B, and C. But then newer specialization came, such as environmental engineering and chemical engineer, and they say, well, actually, a lot of these things we can also do. But these traditional specialization, the big specialization said no, right? This is how it's been since the 1930s, and that's how we want to keep it. So that's one of the issues where the European Union wanted to open up things, but there was conflict between the traditional specialization and insurgent specializations. Another was the opening of the scope of activities also to graduate of 4-year institutions, opposed obviously by 5-year institutions. So in this case, the representation was in the hands of the 5-year institutions and of the old traditional institutions. They control really the levels of power within the technical chamber of Greece. And again, essentially, they won out. So it was really fascinating. I talked to people that really felt very passionately about these issues. And I didn't put the name of the specialization, but now I can. Especially I talked to the president of the chemical engineers. I never met a more pissed off engineer. He was really, really pissed off because he really said, okay, these civil engineers, they really exploited their position to mark the ground against us. We can do so many things. We have been trained to do so many things, but we can actually do them because the civil engineers or the mechanical engineers unfairly blocked us. So what he tried to do actually was to connect with the European Union. He went and talked to the Commission and say, hey, can you guys please pressure my government, the Greek government, to open up the activities so that we chemical engineers can compete with civil engineers, maybe designing factories or things like this. And he failed because the technical chamber of Greece allied with the government to stop that. And the president of the technical chamber, in fact, denounced the poor chemical engineer presidents as a traitor to the country because it had cooperated or tried to cooperate with the European Union. The Germans, literally, yeah. That's, don't mention this to a Greek, that's. And so, as I said, they allied to oppose conditionality. Obviously, the European Commission is not stupid, right? So they saw that the civil engineers and the governments were pushing back, right? So, and the law was passed in 2011, 2012, nothing happened, 2013, nothing happened. So the Commission asked an independent Greek expert to draft a report about what should be done. And this report was used as the basis for the 2014 law that I mentioned before. And this law was supposed to both open up the activities to different specializations and to 4 years engineers. But then the government said, okay, yeah, we passed the law, but then we make the provision that the law can only be implemented, as is often the case in Napoleonic law systems, after a presidential decree, a regulation is passed. Well, the regulation mandated that the presidential decree could only be passed once it's approved with veto power by the technical chamber of Greece, meaning when it's approved by the civil engineers. Nobody was surprised when this presidential decree was never passed, right? But it gets even more kind of interesting in a way, because so the law remained, if you will, dead letter, right? So in 2016, now with the Syriza government, the European Union came back charging in and say, hey, you guys passed the law, but really nothing happened. And so the government passed a final law, 2016 law. Tsipras, by the way, is an engineer by training, speaking again of insiders. Well, the law actually ended up restricting and not opening up the scope of activities. And the new implementation rules said, okay, we take away the veto power of the technical chamber, and we also introduce actually representatives of the newer specialization like chemical engineers, and even of the Hellenic competition authorities. That they were a domestic actor that was obviously very keen on increased competition. And again, by the time of the end of the adjustment plan in 2018, no regulation, no presidential decree had been passed, and by then Greece was no longer in need of money from the European Union. So the strategy of kicking the can down the road eventually worked out pretty well for the engineers. This sums up the findings both in terms of speed and of scope. We don't need to go over them again, but just it graphically shows how the time was longer for the stronger professions, and especially for the professions that were divided. And the scope was full for the poor tourist guides. I felt very bad for them. And then it became lower as the more powerful professions were involved, unless some sub-interests within the profession, such as big practices in the case of lawyers, were involved. So, in other words, to those who have, it shall be given, right? That's the maybe commonsensical conclusion, but again, first is something that is not often remarked in the scholarship on European integration. And secondly, I find it interesting because it colors in my mind how people then see European integration. If you are a tourist guide, how happy are you going to be with European integration compared to a lawyer or to an engineer that ended up being protected, right? So when we talk about, say, populist opposition to European integration, to what extent it's actually caused by the fact that not all farm animals are the same, right? Some are more affected, for better or for worse, than others. And power matters, and cleavages do slow down the implementation of liberalization. Just very briefly, just to be complete, this is the Stolfi and Papamacariou paper. Papamacariou, a colleague from Greece that I needed, obviously, for this type of research. That's the paper that this presentation is based on. It came out last year in the Journal of Public Policy, and these are the other references. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Please just mic off. The first thing I have in mind is actually addressing how different universe of presentation of what is really happening in Greece is from what we've been living in. So generally, one of the things just for all of us here, to open, can we speak about the organized professions in Serbia anymore? I mean, we had several cases like with the taxi drivers or I don't know who else today, maybe teachers who organize like in every September. But I think that generally, this is a question for economists and political sciences, maybe sociologists dealing with the specific parts of the story. Can we at all speak about their organization in this kind of terms or public pressure or whatsoever? Can we speak about trade unions at all today, or this is all so reduced to the, let me say, connections with a specific person or persons? But the general problem is for us, and I will stop here and open the discussion, but what I'm really trying to compare that actually this is the first problem, that our society is not functioning more or less in these kind of terms, in the sense of organized profession that are at least fighting for specific issues. Then another issue is, of course, that huge majority of the government is not thinking at all about implementation of any. I'm very much involved personally, just briefly, in debates on family legislation and so on. And very often when I speak from some people, MPs and people in the power, they say, we will not implement. We have to do that because those guys from Brussels, they are doing pressure on us. So we somehow developed the culture, if I may say, of non-implementation, on avoiding so on. And the third, dead letter culture. Typical, by the way, very often, but here is really very, very, how should I say, developed, and it's progressing, unfortunately. And the third thing is for us as a scientist and social scientist, especially for economists and so on, is our science doing something like this? You know, how many of people in I don't know, in economics, political economists, or people who are doing with specific profession, or let me say in sociology, who is at all following what's happening with the specific professional or let me say social classes, groups, and how much they are able to influence some political parties or whatsoever. Anyway, just I was popping up some of the issues that might be interesting for us. But in a way, first, I really want to thank you. It's a great pleasure personally having you here. And on the other hand, thank you very much for giving us this methodology of what, in a way, political sciences and applied economy should be doing here very much. And finally, I open the floor to the colleagues here, because I really do think that you gave us a lot of food for thinking, working. And I hope this also might be interesting for you. How do we proceed that actually? I see 3 hands here, but okay, let's start with the economists to give them, let me say some prestige just as a comment. Mr. Goran Nikolic, who is our colleague here.
I would say something about not internal redistribution. It is topic worth of interest and exploration, but because we are in Serbia and European Union, there are a lot of problems regarding redistribution in the EU, and you speak about something, but I think that more controversial issue is about influence of EU on the third side, or like Serbia, like African country, and so on, and strong position of EU regarding trade agreements, regarding trade practices, and so on. And Serbia is in a very weak position. Practically, we must. I think it is a bigger problem because there are many studies about EU in internal redistribution, and it is maybe some basic conclusion that to be in EU is better not to be, but not to be and be close to European Union is maybe the worst, and Serbia is such case.
Thank you. Nikola and Jovica.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture and the great presentation. I have two questions. First, you talked about these four groups and their specific issues and their specific fights, but have there been any attempts to connect into wider coalitions across professions, maybe even among professions that are not included here? And if not, why do you think that wasn't the case? And second of all, has there been any attempt to integrate these issues by any of these groups or any other groups to the wider politics of austerity being imposed on Greece at the time? And how did the dynamics of who suffers the most under the austerity measures influence who supports or doesn't support these liberalization measures? As we can imagine that the austerity measures may have hit members of different professions in quite different ways, or maybe not at all. So those would be the two questions.
Thank you. Sorry for this question. I would say the answer is articulated in the sense that on the one hand, a lot of these and other professions had access to voice, right? In terms of, there were a lot of strikes by lawyers as well, other professions like pharmacists. I'm now working on pharmacists, in fact. So there has been obviously a articulation of the position of these professions as not only a kind of parochial protection of their interests, but obviously as an opposition to austerity more generally. But to my mind, so in this sense, there has been, if not cooperation, there has been a common kind of message, right? There hasn't been cooperation, and I don't think it's common to find cooperation among professions, in part because the issues may actually then put different categories against each other. The lawyer that maybe the small lawyer that is against the opening of a profession, maybe it is against the liberalization of taxes, right? Because then it's cheaper for him or her to go from one client to the next. They have different preferences potentially, but also, and not only then, especially like there's more technical professions are so internally divided that their attention is largely really focused on internal conflicts. But also to different degrees, and this actually reminds me of something that Misha said, a lot of these professions or unions representing occupations and so on don't or have lost the idea of representing broad sections of society. They are very much, and it varies from country to country, but certainly it's the case of Greece, or maybe to some extent, say, of Italy and other countries. They are very much focused on developing small-scale individual connections, right? In the paper, I talk about clientelism, right? In some cases, it's just like, okay, how can I influence politics by knowing so-and-so, right? Rather than making a broader, maybe ideological pitch. Yeah, the ideological pitch was made in terms of opposition to austerity, but really what this case and others shows is really that then not only individual professions, but maybe individuals within the professions or groups within the professions just try to pull the strings as much as they can individually, right? And it works. And then it really depends on the system, right? In some countries, governments are more isolated from society, and in others, they are more enmeshed, for better or for worse. And this enmeshing may also mean that these kind of individual actions may pay out.
Okay.
Thank you, Francesco. I also want to start by complimenting the empirical work that you have obviously done in order to complete such research, and I'm really looking forward to reading the paper. And in that light, I'm really interested in the methodological aspect of your research. Just a brief comment before I ask the question, because if you were, as Misha touched upon, if you were to conduct this research in Serbia, you would actually have a very difficult way of just methodologically framing who are you going to interview, because the people who represent themselves as representatives of certain groups are often quite the opposite. They're installed more or less formally or informally by the people in power in the government, and they sort of play a role of being formal representatives, but actually not fighting for the interests of the people that they represent at the profession. And this is especially true in labor and trade unions, which have been totally occupied by people who are professional politicians who play the role. And I would say that their key day-to-day operative activity is preventing other real trade unions in that professions from emerging, so that they can prevent them from actually benefiting from such organizations. So having
some kind of simulacrum of trade union. We don't have real trade unions except in very specific small issues from time to time, just to illustrate. So.
I was going to ask, obviously in Greece it's a different story, but just methodologically speaking, how would you identify the people that are best representative of the interests of the group that you were going to speak, especially as you yourself noticed that there are different interests emerging from within groups, even when they're small? And also, I was wondering just how many interviews did this take, and how was this conducted in Greece with the help of your colleague? Was it English to English, or was it with translation? How did this affect the research? Just methodology.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Just as a general comment on your comment, let's say that it's not only a Serbian issue in a way, right? In the case of Greece, my impression was that it is true representation, but for instance, Greece, I was going to say Italy because it's very similar in that, there is a tradition of parties penetrating society, right? So maybe it's a variation on the Serbian case, but for instance, it was quite striking that, when you look at engineers, there are Syriza engineers, and then there are PASOK. PASOK doesn't exist hardly anymore, but let's say there are New Democracy engineers. There are so essentially you have engineers. They are divided by specialization, but also, they have a party card, right? But even so, in that case, the partisan representation coincided with the interest, because a PASOK or a New Democracy civil engineer still has an interest in protecting the civil engineers, for instance, right? And conversely, I was just reading about the representation of academics in Britain, right? And people were complaining that the trade union of academics, actually they are worried that those who are representing the academics are actually just preparing the ground for a political career. And they're not being actually so forthright in representing the interests of the academics, because they're thinking, so that's, now specifically, I couldn't have done this without Natalia. Natalia is actually, she's not an academic, she's now works for the current government, actually is a fairly high up bureaucrat. And in the practicalities were Some of the interviews were in English. So essentially the evidentiary basis was documents, interviews, and secondary literature and newspapers. Now, the interviews, I conducted a lot of interviews myself with Natalia in English. English is widely spoken, as you probably know, in Greece, and certainly by all those people. And some in Greek by Natalia only, then she then translated them. In terms of identifying the actors, in part it was a snowballing technique, right? So you start like, we went in, so through Natalia, I could end up talking, I could talk to people in the Hellenic Competition Authority. And then they could ask them, okay, who are the important people that I should talk to? And in other cases, it was, okay, literally like cold calling the Union of Tourist Guides. And these people actually, they have their grievances, they're keen to talk. So, or talking to people from the Technical Chamber of Greece, same thing. The representative of the chemical engineers or the environmental engineers, they were very keen to talk because they lost out, right? There were their grievances. So in a way, the system is fairly structured, so it's not that difficult to find who the representatives are. But obviously, if you just, in the case of the technical chamber, if you just talk to the executive, you will get the view of the established, right, and not of the insurgent specialization. So.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was highly detailed and interesting, and I would like to express my most sincere appreciation for having you here today with us. My question would be to ask you about what do you think was missing out of this analysis, perhaps? I think that maybe it was the category of corruption. We could assume that actually the corruptive behavior patterns could be useful in analyzing the concept of how worldviews of these kind of professions actually shape the implementation of legislation. So I think perhaps maybe I'm mostly critical now, but in a constructive manner, is that perhaps one category was missing out of this analysis, and it was actually the corruption as a pattern of behavior. So what do you think maybe is the scope and scale of the corruption in this kind of sense?
I wouldn't, to be honest, I wouldn't go so far as to speak of corruption. It is representation of interests, right? So I'm interested in how interests are represented and who wins and who loses. Essentially, any system of interest intermediation is biased, right? There are some interests that are more equal than others. So it's a matter of maybe try to make it a bit more equal, right? Or what are the mechanisms of representation? In this case, in the paper, I talk about failure and unfairly of clientelism as a category, which needs, however, to be distinguished from corruption, because nothing illegal was done, right? It's pulling levers of who you know and pulling influence, right? Which is a normal way, but it can vary from country to country, but a degree of pulling influence happens in any country. And so I would stay away from the concept of corruption, talking about, as I say in the paper, well, Greece is a good case to see how these minute interests operate, because I would expect them to be very effective, at least some of them, to have special connections, right? So in this case, you could say, well, maybe it's unfair that maybe, say, taxi drivers have special connections to New Democracy and Syriza people, and the tourist guys don't, right? And it's true. So it's a matter of bias rather than corruption. But in in another sense, one may, however, say, and leave it as an open question, to what extent the pressure to open up professions is always positive, right? Maybe to some extent, protecting the livelihood of people, it's a good thing, right? So I wouldn't be so harsh, right? In the article, kind of trying to be this passionate, and obviously there is a balance there. But when you think about the creation of a common market, European Union has been in many ways not very attentive to the interest of people on the ground, right? In the name of creating a common market, this ends up often being actually hitting a blow against the livelihoods of people, right? And there have been many, many cases when the European Court of Justice, for instance, has declared that the rules of competition trump the representation of trade unions, right? And maybe at some point, the balance has shifted too much in the direction.
Good. Do we have more? Please do it. I have, if you several of the things that I would like to address. First, you mentioned 12 countries which are now under the, let me say, process on investigation in a way. Could you tell us which are, or just briefly, more Eastern or more Western?
Both. Don't remember exactly which, but when I checked, both.
Just we have to.
As I was saying, there wasn't any significant geographical difference. I do remember that Bulgaria, so an Eastern country, was named, but so was France, so was Germany.
France and Germany.
Because again, we are talking about, when we talk about this specific interest, this could be anywhere, right? If you think of Germany, there was a very famous case in the history of European legal integration when a French exporter wanted to export the famous liquor Cassis de Dijon, right? Yeah. You probably remember the story, but for those who don't, and the German to Germany, and the German government representing German interests said, well, no, actually we want to prevent importation of Cassis de Dijon because the alcohol content is too low, right? And it's a health reason because the alcohol content is too low and German consumers are going to feel sick because they're going to drink too much of it, right? So what I'm saying is that the interest, they failed, right? The argumentation failed. And it was actually, it's a very famous case in the law of European integration. So yeah, anyway.
Okay. Then another one was that you were speaking mainly about the pressure and the way they were doing internal liberalization of the market. Actually, Bolkesteinian case was mostly about the cross-border and pressure about what to do. Was it, I mean, you didn't mention at all, let me say, any pressure for Greece to open its labor market maybe for another countries? So was this part of the story and how did it go?
Yeah, no. The motivation of the Services Directive is to open up to other countries. So that's the motivation, right?
Of course.
So essentially then it became enmeshed in the case of Greece with broader structural reforms. So the Services Directive is about creating a common European market for professional services. So it's a matter, as I said, of negative integration. You eliminate rules in order to make it easier for people to provide their services across Europe. On top of that, in the case of Greece, it was a matter, according to the Troika, of making the Greek economy more efficient. So of eliminating internal, but they came together, right? And now, in the case of Greece, it really depends on the profession. So, for instance, Greek tourist guides are very annoyed about European tourist guides coming and leading tourist groups, right? Because we are the only ones who should be allowed to do this. Lawyers, not so much, right? Because how many German lawyers can learn Greek and learn the language and the law to practice, right? Engineers, it's also very open. In the case of Greece, for instance, a lot of people from Greece go and study in other European countries, right? Especially in England or Britain. So then they come back and practice law, that's fine, or they practice engineering, and that's fine. So it really depends. It really depends. But the rationale was this negative integration, yes.
Generally. And the third, my final, it's more theoretical, but then again, very practical for us. I mean, it focuses on issue of fiscal federalization. So I'm starting with a horrible Serbian development. At this moment, I think Misha, professor here, is much more in charge for me. And I would ask him to comment because he's now retired, but until recently, he was leading his economists, basically, used to work at the Institute for Urban Development, or precisely, you will tell it more. And they were focusing about the process of internal regionalization, what's happening and so on. And last time we spoke about, 10 years ago, already there was a 2/3 of Serbian GDP produced and located in 100 kilometers from Novi Sad to Belgrade, which is, as you know, horrible. That means that the whole rest of Serbia has like 1/3 of that. And with this government, in the last 10 years, they don't even speak anymore about any need for decentralization, prevent of the whole Serbia moving to Belgrade, and so on and so on. So my question is, generally, what's your experience in these kind of countries? Could let me say, if we one time get better, somebody who's really thinking about what to do with this country, some kind of fiscal federalization might be maybe useful, or does it function anywhere in Europe nowadays as a way of, let me say, at least improving something, or preventing this horrible centralization, which is very often, you could find that in most of East European countries, like, Bulgaria, Hungary, in which you have Budapest with 2 million, and after that, the next biggest town is like with 20,000 people and so on.
What do you mean by fiscal federalization?
I mean, in the sense, like, providing possibilities for, let me say, specific regions to have their own capabilities of trying, at least with reduced taxes or whatsoever, to attract some kind of capital and so on. Because for the time being in Serbia, we have total centralization of decision making, in the sense that any investor has to come to the president's office and directly deal with him. And I think 70% of the public procurements are made now against the law, in direct negotiations and so on. But this is something different. We can speak after that.
Well, my European take on this, I mean, the connection with Europe, is that obviously the European Union has always had a keen interest in developing the either less developed regions of Europe, or all regions that, like, the old industrial areas that fell into the lost competitiveness and so on. So there are these regional programs for regional support that are supposed actually to support the regions independently of the capital or independently of the economic center. At the same time, if we think, for instance, again, about the case of Greece that we just talked about, the increasing competition often means increased pressure to concentrate economic activities in the capital, right? The case of the big city lawyers in the case of Greece is one example, right? You concentrate competitive power where it already is, the capital. So in this sense, I would say that with regard to what, to the European contribution, I would say that it works into compensating, hopefully, or parallel tracks. Increased competitive pressures favor the capital or wherever the already existing competitive capabilities are. On the other hand, the European Union has the mandate to try and bring up the other regions. Having said this, it hasn't been very successful, right? Pretty much anywhere. I mean, if in countries where there is a kind of a fabric that is already kind of spread out, like Germany, it stayed like that. In countries like France, the way to Paris continues to increase, right? Regardless of whatever the European Union does.
But my idea was not only, like structural funds, which we know and so on, but actually anyway, because I know that you were dealing with the fiscal federalism and so on, but is there any case where some kind of fiscal federalism, in the sense, I don't know, letting some other parts of or some regions, maybe some autonomy which they use for specific politics, or has helped them to develop independently of the central government?
Yeah, well, my experience is really, it's with regard to Italy. And Italy moved to a much more federal, it's still a kind of a unitary country, but there's been a lot of devolution, fiscal and otherwise, to the regions. And it's largely been actually unsuccessful, I would say, for two reasons. First, some of the things that have actually been devolved probably were wrongly devolved, and the typical case is health, right? A lot of health issues, think now of COVID, right, are actually national level, right? It doesn't make sense to say that the sub-national levels should deal with them, right? So there's a huge coordination problem. And the other is, in the case of Italy, but applies to other cases as well, is that sub-national governments, the subnational governments of the less developed areas, aside from issues of corruption or crime, don't have the technical skills, right? So if you devolve the resources to them, they don't know what to do with them. This is exactly what happened in Italy. You devolve to the regions, as they're called in Italy, the subnational governments. Those in the north do well because they have the technical skills. Those in the south don't because they don't have the technical skills. So it's not a matter of resources, right?
Yeah. Okay. Do we have some more? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We continue already on Monday, when we will have something completely different, as we would say, but also very interesting and connected with economic issues in a way. This is just to announce a roundtable that we will have speaking about the Serbian-Croatian economic background of the long-lasting debates. And just to mention, this is the famous book from Rudolf Bičanić from 1938, which was called Economic Basis of the Croatian Question, which was still very often quoted, Zundhausen, Merijan Čalić, people who are dealing with that, and which was used as the basis of this Ausgleich in 39, in a way, was some kind of federalization of Yugoslavia that went before the Second World War. And there were 5 Serbian experts who responded to that, but in 1940, and the war started very soon after that, so it really went completely forgotten. So one colleague of us, older economist Boško Mijatović, recollected them, made very nice introduction there, and now is opening the whole those issues, especially from this perspective nowadays about what is the heritage. So there will be some colleagues of ours, but also professors coming outside and the author of that. And I think it's going to be also very interesting. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us. Thanks to colleagues who were with us through Zoom. And Francesco, I think you deserved some good rakia. So we could go after that, Thank you very much.